The price of freedom is to be aware of your own awareness. And that, you see, is a terribly lonely and suffering-inducing thing. You see, most people live their lives without ever truly catching sight of themselves. They run about as if on a stage saying their lines, playing their parts, yet never realizing that they are actors and that the play is not the only reality. They do not question. They do not pause to look at the looker, to hear the hearer, to feel the feeler. They are absorbed by the noise of life. And so life for them is noisy but simple. But to become aware of awareness itself is to step out of that flow as though you had suddenly discovered you were both actor and audience at once. You are watching yourself live, and in that watching a strange distance arises. That is what I mean when I say the price of freedom is loneliness. For once you see, you cannot unsee, and once you know, you cannot return to ignorance. Freedom is not merely the ability to choose between tea or coffee, to go here or there, to accept or reject this or that. True freedom is to awaken to the fact that you are not simply swept along by the tide of your impulses, but that you are the tide and the shore and the ocean itself. And that realization, as liberating as it sounds, is at first frightening beyond measure. Because when you awaken in this way, you suddenly find that you are standing alone on the cliff of consciousness, gazing out into an abyss that has no bottom. Most people are comforted by their belonging to a family, to a culture, to a religion, to a nation. They cling to identities like a man clutching to a piece of driftwood in the sea. But when you awaken to awareness, you discover that all these identities are costumes, temporary roles, fragile little boats on an endless ocean. And you who thought yourself the boat suddenly realize you are the water. How unsettling! To be the water is to belong everywhere and nowhere at once. And that is where the loneliness comes in. For while others chatter happily, bound together by the illusion of their masks, you see through the masks, and you cannot quite join the game in the same way. It is as though you had gone backstage at the theater and seen the ropes and pulleys, the painted props, the actors rehearsing their lines. Now, when you return to your seat in the audience, you cannot be deceived as before. You laugh, but with a different laughter. You weep, but with a different sorrow. You are both inside and outside, both participant and witness. This is the beginning of suffering for the awakened one. He sees too much. He feels the weight of truth pressing against the fragile walls of ordinary life. He recognizes that his freedom, this precious awareness, has cost him the comfort of belonging, the innocence of ignorance. Now, this awakening does something peculiar. It separates you. When you first begin to see clearly, it is not that you are literally cut off from the world, but that you feel cut off. The herd moves in one direction and you hesitate, you ask questions, you resist, and immediately the herd senses something is different about you. And this is one of the oldest instincts in humanity, to distrust the one who stands apart. For in ancient times, survival depended on conformity. The tribe had its rituals, its taboos, its rules. To question those was to endanger everyone. So the one who thought differently, who sought differently, was often cast out, ridiculed, or even sacrificed. That old pattern has not vanished. It remains, though disguised. In modern life, people mock what they do not understand. They exclude what threatens their sense of safety. The one who awakens finds himself misinterpreted, even feared. And so he feels once again alone. But here is the twist. The separation is both illusion and truth. It is an illusion because in the deepest sense, no one is separate. The very air you breathe was exhaled by the trees. The very water in your blood once flowed in rivers. The very atoms in your bones were born in stars. You are not apart from life. You are life itself. And yet in the eyes of society, you are separate. For society thrives on agreement, on shared fictions, money, law, reputation, morality. These are collective dreams. When you awaken, you see that they are dreams. And therefore, you cannot quite worship them as others do. You may still play the game, but you know it is a game. And nothing unsettles the players more than the one who knows the rules are not real. So the awakened man walks between worlds. Outwardly he works, he speaks, he eats, he laughs. Inwardly he carries a knowledge that cannot be shared easily. For language was not built for it. If he speaks too directly, he is dismissed as mad. If he stays silent, he suffocates under the weight of his vision. This is why separation is such a heavy burden. You long for communion, for someone to look at you and say, "Yes, I see it too." But such encounters are rare. And so you suffer the strange exile of being alive in a world that does not yet know it is dreaming. And yet, listen carefully. The exile is the proof of your freedom. For if you feel separate, it means you have stepped outside the herd's hypnosis. You are no longer carried along unconsciously. You are awake. And with awakening comes the ache of solitude. But the story does not end with loneliness or exile. Something else arrives. Responsibility. Once you have seen through the masks, once you have realized the illusory nature of belonging, a new burden falls upon your shoulders. You cannot simply go back to sleep. You cannot unknow what you know. And with knowledge comes obligation. You see, most people live by borrowed purposes. They inherit them from parents, from culture, from religion. Be successful, be respectable, raise a family, serve your country. These purposes are like ready-made suits hanging in a shop. You walk in, try one on, and suddenly you have an identity, a role to play. You need not question whether the suit truly fits. You simply wear it because everyone else is dressed. But the awakened one cannot wear these suits so easily. He sees the threads, the seams, the artificiality of it all. And so he must find or forge his own purpose. This is what I call the tyranny of destiny. It feels at first like a calling, something deep within whispers that you were not meant to simply consume and reproduce to shuffle along with the rest. You sense that your life has a direction, a weight, a meaning that is uniquely yours. And yet, oh, how crushing this can be. For where others are content to drift, you feel compelled to steer. Where others are content to rest, you feel compelled to labor. And here another paradox arises. For purpose is a double-edged sword. On one side, it gives your suffering meaning. You endure not in vain, but as part of a journey, a mission, a becoming. But on the other side, purpose chains you. You cannot abandon it without betraying yourself. All right? You are driven sometimes to the point of exhaustion by this inner demand to live authentically, to live awake. And so the one who has awakened suffers not only from loneliness, not only from exile, but from the terrible weight of his own destiny. He has seen too much to live shallowly. But he has not yet arrived at the fullness of his becoming. He is in a sense trapped between worlds, no longer blind, but not yet free. And that, my friends, is why awareness is such a costly gift. It is freedom, yes, but it is also a cross to bear. To be awake is to be torn between belonging and isolation, between rest and responsibility, between the comfort of ignorance and the burden of truth. Awareness brings loneliness. Loneliness brings separation. Separation brings responsibility. Each step deepens the suffering. Yet each step also deepens the freedom. And the question is, what do we do with this suffering? Does it destroy us or transform us? Is it punishment or is it the very forge in which we are remade? You see, we have this idea that strength is shown in the lifting of great weights, in the conquering of mountains, in the triumph of the will. But strength, real strength, is not the capacity to bend the world to your liking. It is the willingness to be bent by the world and not break. It is the capacity to endure wounds that do not close and still walk on. Now that sounds very strange, doesn't it? Because we imagine strength as invulnerability, as a fortress of steel, yet what is steel without the fire that tempers it? What is courage if nothing threatens it? You cannot measure the resilience of a bridge unless it is shaken by storms, unless rivers rise to test its foundations. So it is with the human soul. The paradox of strength is that it comes not from avoiding suffering but from passing through it. It is the wound that teaches, the scar that becomes a symbol of endurance. And the one who has carried such wounds finds that his wisdom, his depth is not in spite of them, but because of them. Think of the old myths. The king who limps. The healer who himself is sick. The prophet with a thorn in the flesh. They are marked by injury. But their injury is the very thing that grants them sight into mysteries others cannot see. The wound opens a door, and through it seeps a kind of knowing that no book, no doctrine, no mere comfort could ever reveal. You may wonder why this should be so. Why not grant insight without pain? Why not bless strength without scars? But life, you see, is not constructed for convenience. It is woven of tension, of strain, of contrast. Without cold, you cannot feel warmth. Without silence, there is no music. Without the risk of death, there is no vitality in living. And so the strongest are often those who have been broken. Not because the breaking was pleasant, but because it stripped away illusion, because it burned away pride, because it forced the soul into an intimacy with existence that the comfortable never taste. There is a kind of nobility in suffering that is not about masochism, not about loving pain for its own sake, but about realizing that pain is not meaningless. It is a teacher, fierce, uncompromising, but truthful. It speaks in riddles. Yes, but riddles that if lived through reveal treasures deeper than gold. The paradox then is this. The one who suffers deeply becomes the one most able to carry others. His own wound becomes a lantern, a reminder that though the night is long, the dawn has always been hidden in it. He becomes a bearer of the wound, not ashamed of it, not hiding it, but holding it forth as a kind of torch that says, here is the proof that one can survive. And strangely enough, it is through such vulnerability that the world comes to trust him. For we do not trust those who seem untouchable, perfect, above all harm. We trust the ones whose eyes show they have wept, whose hands show they have labored, whose heart shows it has been broken and yet remains open. That is strength. Not the clenched fist, but the open hand. Not the iron wall, but the tree that bends in the storm and still remains rooted. And so the wound, instead of being a curse, becomes a mark of authenticity, a seal that this one has truly lived. For suffering is not an isolated thing. It is part of a dance as old as the stars. You see, existence itself is woven of opposites. Night and day, birth and death, fullness and emptiness, and each calls the other into being. Imagine music. If you only had sound with no silence, there would be no rhythm, no melody, only noise. If you only had silence with no sound, there would be no song. Music is born in the relationship, the interplay, the alternation. So it is with life. Joy without sorrow would be meaningless. Freedom without limitation would evaporate into a kind of void. Then is not the enemy of freedom. It is its partner. They move together like yin and yang, each shaping the other's form. If you wish to taste the sweetness of liberation, you must first know the bitterness of bondage. If you desire the ecstasy of release, you must feel the weight of chains. But notice, this is not cruelty. This is art. This is the cosmic painter using shadow so that the light may shine more vividly. This is the dancer moving backward so the next step forward has grace. And to resist this dance, to want only one side, is to miss the very beauty of the whole. The difficulty, of course, is that when we are caught in suffering, we do not see the dance. We see only the darkness, the cold, the absence of joy. But later, sometimes much later, we discover that it was through that darkness that our eyes adjusted, that we learned to recognize the faintest flicker of light. Freedom then is not the absence of suffering, but the ability to move with it. To see that the chains were not meant to strangle, but to carve your strength. To see that every limit, every frustration was sculpting a capacity for release you could not otherwise have imagined. Think of the seed underground, pressed by soil, split open by pressure, drenched by rain. If you were that seed, you might say, "This is unbearable. This is destruction." But in truth, it is germination. It is the necessary prelude to sprouting, to rising toward the sun. So too, your suffering is not the final word. It is the soil cracking, the seed splitting, the ground trembling, with the birth of something new. And the freedom you long for is not at odds with this process. It is hidden within it. The dance of opposites says, do not cling to one side. Do not curse the other. See them both as movements of the same eternal rhythm. To embrace this is to discover a serenity that no circumstance can shake, because you realize at last that even in pain there is a kind of secret freedom. And even in freedom there is a memory of pain. That is the wisdom of yin and yang. They are not enemies locked in struggle, but lovers locked in embrace. And through their union life flows. We have spoken of wounds and strength, of suffering and freedom, of the opposites that weave existence. But what finally does it mean? It means quite simply that the one who bears great trials is not cursed, but entrusted. Entrusted with the knowledge that life is not about avoiding pain, nor about clinging to pleasure, but about entering fully into the rhythm of both. Entrusted with the capacity to look suffering in the face and not turn away, but to say, yes, you too are part of me. When this realization dawns, something astonishing happens. The loneliness fades. The sense of being singled out, burdened beyond measure, dissolves, because you see that your suffering is not just yours. It is the suffering of humanity, of life itself. And to carry it is to participate in something vast, something universal. The release is not escape. It is not a sudden erasure of wounds, not the granting of eternal sunshine. It is the deep breath of acceptance. The laughter that erupts when you see the grand irony of it all. That what you thought was your curse has been your teacher. That what you fled has been your companion. That what you feared has been shaping you into who you are. And in that laughter, you are free. Free not because life has been tamed, but because you no longer demand it to be otherwise. Free not because the storm has ended, but because you have learned to dance in the rain. The final paradox, then, is that the burden which once crushed you becomes the very weight that grounds you. The chains that once bound you become the links by which you connect to others. The wound that once bled you becomes the scar that shines as testimony. I have lived. I have suffered, and yet I am still here. And so the story is not of a man crushed by fate, but of a being who through wounds, through darkness, through endless paradox discovers that life itself is enough. That awareness itself with all its terror and all its beauty is the very miracle we sought from the beginning. The curtain falls, but the music plays on. And you, having danced through suffering into freedom, realize you were never just the wounded, never just the struggling, never just the chosen. You were always life itself playing its eternal game of hide and seek, suffering and release, darkness and light. And perhaps that is the ultimate secret, that there was never anything to escape, only something to awaken to.